spears, then swords, and then fire. Isabella had crossed the sea a broken queen. But now, England trembled beneath her boots. Her husband was on the run. Her enemy hid behind castle walls, and for the first time in her life, Isabella held all the power. As Queen Isabella and her growing army marched through southern England, town after town opened its gates. Farmers wept with relief. Priests blessed her banners. Nobles, even those who had once opposed her, bent the knee. The land rejoiced, one chronicler wrote, as if freed from a curse. Why? Because Isabella had done what no one else had dared. She stood against Edward II and the Despensers, and she was winning. London itself, once loyal to the king, rebelled. The royal treasury was seized. Despenser's allies were hunted down. The queen had returned, not in gold, but in vengeance. By mid-October 1326, Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger were on the run. They fled from castle to castle, first to Gloucester, then to South Wales, dragging behind them what remained of the royal guard. Edward was in shock. His once loyal court had crumbled overnight. His barons had either surrendered or defected. Even some bishops had declared for Isabella and Despenser. He grew increasingly paranoid. He ordered executions of suspected traitors. He torched towns that refused to provide shelter. He slept in different rooms each night, afraid of assassination. But nothing could stop what was coming. At Bristol Castle, Isabella caught up with part of the royal inner circle. There she captured Eleanor de Clare, Despenser's wife, and Isabella's own cousin. The queen ordered her imprisoned, along with the royal children who had remained loyal to the king. Bristol fell in just a few days. The message was clear. There is no safety left for traitors. Mortimer took control of the region. Isabel, law pressed on, toward the final hunt. On November 16, 1326, near Neath Abbey in Wales, Edward II and Despenser were finally captured. They had tried to hide among monks, hoping for sanctuary. But word had spread. Loyalists betrayed them for mercy. They were dragged from the church in chains. Edward was silent, broken, shivering. Despenser screamed. Edward was taken to Kenilworth Castle, under guard by the very nobles he had once condemned. He was allowed letters and prayers, but no allies, no servants, and no contact with the outside world. The once mighty king was now a prisoner of his own queen. Isabella made no effort to visit him. Instead, she turned her attention to the man she truly came for. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger stood before a public tribunal in Hereford. But it was no trial. There was no judge, no defense, no mercy. The charges read: theft of crown lands, abuse of royal power, imprisonment of nobles, rape, tyranny, and the dishonor of the queen. Isabella did not appear in person, but her seal was stamped at the top of every charge. The sentence: death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. The most brutal punishment English law could give, reserved for traitors. On a cold November morning, the people of Hereford gathered to witness what would become one of the most infamous executions in medieval England. Despenser was stripped naked, smeared with filth, and paraded through the streets on horseback upside down, as crowds jeered and pelted him with mud and offal. Then, the scaffold. He was hanged briefly until near death, cut down alive, disemboweled while conscious, his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, his heart ripped out, and finally his body was quartered and sent to 4 corners of the kingdom. One part was nailed to London Bridge, where it rotted in the wind. It was not justice. It was a message. No man humiliates a queen and lives. Though she did not attend the execution, Isabella watched the rising smoke from the castle walls. She said nothing. Those around her reported a silence so complete it seemed the air itself had frozen. Mortimer placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not flinch. With Despenser gone and Edward imprisoned, Isabella called a parliament. For the first time in English history, a woman, not a widow but a wife, ruled openly as regent, backed by the nobility. She was crowned defender of the realm, not in ceremony, but by force of loyalty. And beside her stood Prince Edward, the future king, raised by a mother who had conquered without ever raising a sword herself. She had marched with no official army, overthrown a crowned king, executed the most feared man in England, and done it all without papal sanction or foreign invasion. She was now the most powerful woman in Europe. The land began to recover. Nobles returned. Taxes were lifted. Churches reopened. The people chanted her name in the streets. But Isabella knew her power was temporary. Her son was growing. Mortimer's ambition was growing, and whispers of resentment stirred among the barons. Still, in that winter of 1300, she had achieved the impossible. I have been silenced, disgraced, betrayed, but I have outlived my enemies, she told her chaplain. And now, I write the law. The queen who had once wept in locked chambers had become a storm across the land. But power gained by fire never lasts without consequence. For Isabella of France, revenge was only the beginning. The queen who conquered a king now sat on a throne not built for her. Around her, enemies were dead, lovers were rising, and history waited. For power does not erase the past, it magnifies its cost. With Despenser executed and Edward II imprisoned, Isabella of France stood at the height of her power. She summoned a great parliament in January 1327, where she announced that Edward II was no longer fit to rule. Nobles, bishops, and even commoners agreed. The king has failed in duty, in justice, and in honor, the barons declared. And so, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, now crowned King Edward III. But a child could not rule, and so Isabella became regent. At her side stood the real architect of the rebellion, her lover, Roger Mortimer. Together, they now ruled England in all but name. At first, the people rejoiced. But soon, the new regime began to feel eerily familiar. Mortimer and Isabella seized vast estates of traders, keeping the wealth for themselves, placed spies in noble households, controlled the king's schedule, education, and advisors, and punished dissent with swift executions. One chronicler wrote, "We traded wolves for leopards, but the teeth are the same." The court began calling Mortimer not Lord Protector, but the king in everything but name. And Isabella? She had become a shadowed figure, withdrawn, watched, and quietly feared. Roger Mortimer had once been a rebel, a fugitive, a lover. Now he was de facto ruler of England. He dressed in silks and crimson. He demanded to be addressed as my Lord Earl of March. He even refused to kneel before the young king, a grave insult to royal tradition. Those who questioned him disappeared. One noble was found hanged in his own stables. Another vanished on the road to London. Behind these acts was not always Mortimer's hand, but his influence, and Isabella looked the other way. She gave him her body, one courtier whispered, and now he wears her crown. Though crowned, Edward III was still a boy. He was allowed no counsel of his own. His letters were read before they were sent. He was never left alone with allies, only with Mortimer's men. But Edward watched. He listened. He studied the court, the whispers, the fear, and slowly the boy began to understand the truth. They killed my father, and now they rule through me. In private, Edward began forging silent alliances with old loyalist families, especially the powerful de Bohuns and the Plantagenet cousins. By 1329, murmurs had turned to grumbles. Barons asked, why had Isabella not stepped down now that Edward was king? Why did Mortimer speak for the crown? Why had England not declared war on France after Gascony was lost? Mortimer silenced critics brutally. He had Henry of Lancaster, the king's uncle, accused of treason. He placed guards outside Parliament. And in a shocking move, he had a bishop executed for criticizing royal policy. Isabella defended Mortimer publicly. But in private, she began to fear him. He had grown beyond lover. He had become something colder and untouchable. In September 1327, news reached the court. Edward II was dead. The official cause? Natural illness in Berkeley Castle. But the timing was suspicious. Some said he had been smothered. Others claimed something worse, a red-hot poker through the bowels to leave no mark. The chronicles remain conflicted. But one thing was certain. His death cleared the path for Isabella and Mortimer to rule without question. Isabella wore mourning black. But she held no funeral, and she never spoke his name again. As years passed, Isabella began to fade from public life. Once hailed as a queen of strength, she became a symbol of silent complicity. She sat beside Mortimer, but said little. She walked the palace halls like a ghost. Even her son avoided her gaze. In private, she took to long hours in her chapel, speaking to no one. Some said she wept for the man she helped destroy. Others believed she feared what she had become. A crown is not always forged in gold, she wrote in a private letter. Sometimes it is built from bone and silence.